Now let's look at Apache log formatting. This will help us to understand how Apache logs information to its log files. So there are two types of log files that are created: the error log and the access log. By default, Apache defines these two log files as catch-all files in the respective log directory. So if you take a look at varlog httpd as we've done, let's just open a shell and take a look here. You'll see a number of log files, also those that are rotated by log rotate. The access_log file is the catch-all log file that contains hits to the web server. And it's a catch-all because regardless of the status of the host for the web instance, whether it's the default host or the virtual host, one or more, if a log file is not defined, then by default the catch-all, which is spelled out in the default host, will be logged to access_log. So it's a catch-all for all virtual hosts and the default hosts, unless you specify an access log on a per virtual host basis. So all hits go here. So HTTP hits end up here by default. Whereas in varlog httpd error_log, this is a container for errors. Errors accessing content. And those errors tend to be of the order of 400 errors, so 4xx, as well as 500 errors, 5xx. Whereas hits tend to be 2xx and 3xx. 3xx error messages are redirects of content. So let's say you attempted to access a file that is no longer the current file, then the web server, if properly configured, could redirect you using a 300 related error to the new content, or perhaps to a different website. Whereas 2xx errors means that you had no trouble accessing the content. Whereas 400 errors tends to mean that there was some sort of permissions error or inability to access content because it doesn't exist on the server, or perhaps permissions related. 500 errors tends to mean something is wrong with the server. So server errors. And these error codes can be researched online. They're well documented. Apache subscribes to standard HTTP error codes. So these are the two catch-all files, error and access. A number of variables drive the formatting of the records that are in these documents. And they're spelled out in the primary config file. So vars are defined in etc httpd conf httpd.conf. And let's just also note that log vars are arranged into groups that are referenced per virtual host. So rather than reconstructing the variables on a per virtual host basis, there is a directive called log format, which allows us to amalgamate the variables that are of interest and assign them to a nickname that can then be referenced on a per virtual host basis. So let's set up some tasks so we can explore these ideas. Our first step is to explore etc httpd conf httpd.conf in search of the log format section. And this is where you'll see references to error access and the amalgamation of variables into a log format name. So let's take a look by navigating into conf and modifying httpd.conf and searching the document using Control W for log format, which will take us to the area where the logs are spelled out. Now, we mentioned that Apache will log at the warning level or higher when there are errors experienced by clients accessing content or by the server. So that's a given. And also note that there's a directive which reads error log, which redirects all errors experienced between the client and the server, including on the server side, into the file error_log, and it logs at the level warning or higher. So beyond errors, which are always trapped into error_log, this is where the log format directive amalgamates a variety of variables and associates them with a particular name that can then be referenced on a per virtual host basis rather than reconstructing them each time. So a number of these items are defined. Let's take a look at these by copying the entire block and pasting it into our notes. Now the format that you see here is rather straightforward. Log format takes variables specified between quotes and associate them with a name, and then you reference the name. So what do these variables mean? Well, let's spell them out. %h from the first one references the connecting host. Now with the default name resolution turned off, this means the IP address. So connecting host's IP address. This can also be IPv6 as well. So whatever address that was used to access the content by the client will be reflected by %h. So wherever %h is referenced in a log format statement, that's how you will see the representation in the log file. So the order in which these variables are presented is important because this is how the data appear in the log file. So you'll first see %h followed by the other variables, %l, so on and so forth, in each and every log file. Then we see %l. %l relates to data that typically are not available. It's an ident check. And this information is usually not available. So it's typically simply a hyphen. Fields that are not available are referenced or represented by a hyphen. So you'll see a host name, which is usually an IP address, followed by a hyphen indicating there's no ident information. Ident is not a widely used protocol anymore, but it's still used for legacy reasons, or reference for legacy reasons, for those clients who do supply ident information. What follows, and let's just note, not used much anymore. So this will typically be a hyphen. What follows is %u. %u represents the connecting user. The connecting user is also often unknown. So often unknown. And as a consequence results in simply a hyphen being represented. Now there are times that the user who is connecting is known. For example, if you have protected content with credentials and the connecting client supplies those credentials, then the connecting user will be known. Or if you're using some sort of authentication framework that forces the user to supply credentials, then obviously their username will be known. But this is typically unknown and left as such. So far we've got two dud variables, %l and %u. Now there's the all-important %t variable, which is always known. This represents the timestamp of which the client connected to the server to access content. The timestamp represents time information with day 2-digit, month 3 letters, so Jan for example for the current, as well as year 4-digit, as well as hour, minute, second, and time zone. This is how the timestamp information is represented by Apache. And it is always known so long as Apache is running, so expect to find some sort of time information which reflects a 2-digit day, 3-letter month, 4-digit year, hour, minute, second, and time zone. This information is always present. What follows %t is an escape of quotes to preserve the value. So above we see a backslash, which is the official escape character in Unix and Linux systems, which means the quote that follows is preserved, and %r is represented, and the quote which follows that is preserved. So it's a way of wrapping quotes around the variable. So %r represents the request method. There are a number of methods that are used to access content from an HTTP server. Among them, the two most that you'll find in log files are get and post. But there are a number of request methods. So we'll just note, etc. You can always Google HTTP request methods and you'll see the list of methods. But GET requests involve accessing a URL and passing variables, for example, and or passing variables within the URL string. POST deals with forms, submitting information, for example, to an action script. So you'll see largely gets and sometimes posts, but you'll always see a request method, so that information is expected to exist within the log file. Then we see % greater than s. This particular variable represents the status code returned to the client. So status code returned to the client. And these values range from between 200 and 500 related errors. So 200 to 500 related errors. As mentioned, as a summarization of these error groups, 200 errors are usually good, 300 errors are usually redirects, 400 errors usually indicates permissions problems or some sort of missing content like a 404, and 500 errors represent server problems. So you've got a class of errors that deal with the server itself, the content, the fact that the content no longer exists as it were, and everything's okay with 200 errors. The content was accessed as expected. Then we see %b. %b represents the size of the content returned to the client. So this will return the number of bytes returned to the client. It's good for summarization of the amount of data that have traversed your Apache server. And after %b in the first log format for combined, we also see two other variables. They include the refer, so that's %refer, and the refer is the IP address or name that led you to the content. This is an important variable in determining who sent traffic to your site. So contains IP of sending host. So this means where your links exist elsewhere on other servers. So supposing you do a Google search for Linux CBT, you click on that link, the refer variable will show that Google referred you to us. That's stored in the refer variable. And the last variable that you see represented is the user agent. The user agent variable tells you the client that is connecting, whether it be an iPhone, a Droid phone, or a standard desktop browser. It is represented in the user agent. So type of HTTP client, i.e. Droid, iPhone, Safari, i.e. Firefox, etc. Now these variables that we've just listed are for the most part all-encompassing. There are a couple more variables, but these cover the bulk of the variables that most people track. And they're summarized in the combined nickname, which is further referenced. We also see other types of log formats which use a subset of the variables. Notice, for example, the common log format uses all but refer and user agent variables. So supposing you wanted to log everything sans these two variables, you could simply, on your virtual host, reference the common log format. Supposing you wanted to log independently refers and user agents, then indeed you can reference these which are already predefined. And if you wanted any other subset of the variables presented, you can create your own format, just use a unique name with the log format directive, and then reference that name wherever you define a virtual host. Now let's hit the server and extract a record. Here's an IPv6 query to the server. We'll refresh it to get the latest instance. Let's refresh it a number of times using Control-R. We'll then extract this record from var log. So let's find from the shell here. We'll tail, and in fact there is a symlink one level up to the logs directory, so we don't need to actually specify /var/log. So let's look at the access log. And here we see the most recent attempt to access content from the server. So let's copy it and just quickly discuss the variables that are present in this particular log entry. So unlike syslog, which always precedes each line with timestamp information, Apache doesn't. It represents a timestamp later on. In fact, it's the fourth field over. So the first field includes our source IPv6 address in this particular case. Otherwise, you'd see IPv4, followed by 2 hyphens as mentioned for the ident check and connecting user, because we didn't authenticate. So these are both hyphened or non-existent. Followed by the timestamp format we mentioned. So it is the 26 2-day format. Jan is the 3-letter representation. Quad year, hour, minute, second, and the time zone, which is -500 or GMT -5. Followed by the request method, %r, and it shows that it's a GET request. And the client requested this particular content. Now, we didn't directly indicate that we wanted to access Apache_pb2.gif, but by virtue of the embedded GIF file in this page, it was referenced by the page for us. So it was requested on our behalf to properly display the page. So it's a GET request for that particular GIF using HTTP 1.1. And we see in the next variable over the status code 304, so that's a redirect to the content, followed by the byte size, which in this case doesn't show up because it was a redirect, so that particular image may not have displayed properly, followed by, since it's a redirect, or there may be another record which represents the amount of bytes sent to the client, followed by the refer. So the default document referred us to make this GET request for the GIF file. That's why the refer variable has been noted, followed by the user agent. So we connected with Mozilla Firefox from Red Hat, so on and so forth. That's just one record from the bunch. There are other records requesting content. So for example, here is one that represents a request of the home page. So for each request, ostensibly, there's a request for the home page and one for the GIF file. So indeed, this is a request for the page which contains no refer. And if you tail logs error_log, you'll see any errors that pertain to the configuration. So for example, the client directory index forbidden by options directive. So this is just a marker to indicate that the client may not enumerate the contents of the directory because it's forbidden. And similarly, if you access the content using IPv4, the same page is returned, and then when you tail the contents of the access log, the IPv4 address is shown twice, once for accessing the root content and the other for accessing other content. In this case, we see other references in search of, for example, the favicon.icon, which probably is not there and has generated some sort of 300 related. In fact, 404. Here's the 404 because we have not placed a favicon.icon, so it's a 404. And here are the other requests. This is the first request for the content. And then here's a request for the GIF file. This came back as a 200 error, so that means the content actually exists from icons. In fact, you can try to access this content directly just to be sure, and it should come back, and presumably it's included with the Apache build. And there is the image. So that means it was pulled. So it's probably towards the end of the page, and there's the image. So it was actually pulled. Reference by an alias, which generated the 300 error before. So the log file is rather straightforward. Nothing much going on, nothing terribly difficult to understand. Let's just take one more look at httpd.conf and search for log format. And this is where it all begins. So in your virtual hosts, reference one of these, common refer agent combined, and then you'll be able to track those variables. There's even one for combined I/O for input and output to help you report on traffic in, traffic out. But also note, you can define your own log formats and reference them if you'd like. And also note that by default, if you neglect to define access and or error logs, then the default hosts will log traffic to your site in the standard or default access_log and error_log file. And one other point that we'd like to make is that you can log simultaneously with multiple formats. So you may log hits or traffic using multiple log formats simultaneously to separate files. This allows you, for example, to keep track of, let's say, all information referencing the combined format in one log file, and perhaps refer information in another file to keep track of who sent you the clients or who sent you the HTTP clients, or perhaps to keep track of the various user agents independently so you can report on just user agents sans the other information. Perhaps the most sound advice is to create as little disk I/O as possible, logging only once and then post-processing. Unless you need the results immediately, it perhaps is less costly to log once and post-process the results, extracting the variables that are of interest to you. Otherwise, you'll cause your Apache server to incur more expensive disk I/O requests, even in the presence of fast disk I/O. So that's the Apache log format. Let's move on.